Welcome back to the Pluralist Podcast, where we talk about Judaism, democracy, and the struggle for a just, equal, and inclusive Israel. Israel was founded to be both a Jewish and democratic state, but for too long we've been told we have to choose between the two. Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Judaism still dominate public Jewish life in Israel. Over time, Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox leaders have grown more extreme and often incite against women, LGBTQ people, Palestinian citizens of Israel, and anyone who doesn't fit their narrow definition of Jewish life. So it's no surprise that many Israelis are now asking, if this is Judaism, do I want to be part of it at all? This is where the Reform movement comes in. We reject the false choice between Jewish identity and liberal values. We say you can have both. You can be Jewish and believe in equality, justice, and human rights. This is what Reform Judaism stands for. In today's political climate, with the most extreme government Israel has ever known, this message is more urgent than ever. Where they offer hate, we offer hope. We've said it for years. There is more than one way to be Jewish in the Jewish state. This message is resonating with the Israeli public. People are seeking a different kind of Judaism, one that is inclusive, egalitarian, and rooted in compassion. A recent survey we commissioned found that millions of Israelis now see Reform Judaism as a real alternative, and we will talk about these findings shortly. Of course, our movement isn't new. We've built more than 50 congregations across the country. We have a youth movement, a pre-army Mechina gap year program, and vibrant communities of young adults and Russian speakers. We operate schools and preschools and offer educational programs in dozens of schools around the country. Our rabbinical court welcomes hundreds of people each year into the Jewish people through liberal conversions. And IRAC, the legal and public advocacy arm of our movement that I'm honored to lead, works to defend democracy and civil rights. Of course, growth also brings backlash. Just a few weeks ago, on Memorial Day Eve, a violent mob descended on a Reform synagogue in Ra'anana, determined to silence a message of peace and collective remembrance. They attacked a peaceful live screening of a joint Israeli-Palestinian memorial ceremony. They assaulted dozens of people, including myself. I was there that night. I was one of the people they tried to silence. And like so many others, I walked away shaken, but more determined than ever. This is not an isolated incident. Just a week before the attack in Ra'anana, the Reform synagogue in Netanya was vandalized with hateful graffiti, and not for the first time. This is a time of deep uncertainty in Israel. So many of us are concerned for our safety, our democracy, and our future. But this troubling reality proves how essential a liberal Jewish voice is, a voice that stands for equality, for compassion, and for dignity, not just for some, but for all. We say you don't have to choose between being Jewish and being democratic. We can be both. We must be both. Today, we'll talk about what it means to lead in such a difficult moment, what it means to hold onto hope in a time of fear, and to build a better future in Israel. I can't think of a better person to have that conversation with than my dear friend and colleague, Anna Kislanski, CEO of the Israel Movement for Reform and Progressive Judaism. Anna, thank you for coming here.
Thank you, Orly. It's a pleasure being here with you.
So let's start by you telling us a little bit about yourself and tell our listeners about your journey that led you to the Reform movement.
Well, thank you. I hope I won't bore you, Orly, because you've heard the story several times already. But I think it's important to emphasize that most of the leadership of our movement and many people in our movement did not necessarily grow up in a Jewish liberal or a Reform setting. So this was also my case. I grew up completely secular. My parents made Aliyah from the former Soviet Union in the early 1970s. I was only 2 years old. And a lot of the things that my parents learned throughout the years living in Israel was actually through me and my brothers, especially when it comes to Judaism, because in Soviet Russia, you weren't allowed to observe Judaism. So celebrating the holidays is something that we actually brought. We learned at school that this is the time to buy a Chanukiah, to light the Hanukkah menorah, and buy sufganiyot for Hanukkah, or it's time to celebrate Passover. And we would come to our parents and we would ask to to do that. So I grew up in a completely secular background, and this was the case until my early 20s. And then by coincidence, as a student, I started working for a Jewish organization that was conducting mifgashim, encounters between Jews from the diaspora and Jews from Israel, mostly youth. And I was asked one summer to conduct a mifgash like this, an encounter between NIFTY, the North American youth movement, the North American Reform youth movement, and Israeli youth. So the first time that I ever met Reform Jews was through those young people. And when they had a rabbi accompany them, I did not identify him at first. They asked me, my supervisor, my Israeli supervisor, asked me to be polite when the Americans come and to greet the rabbi. And of course, I was looking to greet the rabbi, but I couldn't recognize him.
Because you had in mind an Orthodox
Exactly.
rabbi with a beard.
With a beard and long pants and, like tzitzit and like long sleeves, everything. And then comes this really nice young guy with wearing Bermuda shorts and Tiva sandals and introducing himself as the rabbi. So I said to myself, wow, I never met a rabbi like that. And the whole week was magical for me. It was a revelation because I for the first time, I heard how the Americans sing Birkat Hamazon. I never had a chance to really listen to Birkat Hamazon being sung. And I said to myself, wow, I'm missing so much of that Judaism. You take matriculation test as an Israeli kid, growing up in Israel on the Bible. I know all the stories of the Bible, but I never opened a Siddur. I didn't know how to pray. And suddenly I see these Americans knowing how to pray, and us Israelis were looking at them with our jaws open, dropped, exactly. So I started a journey of discovery. A year later, my then boyfriend, now husband, Arthur, we wanted to get married, and I already knew that I didn't want to get married through the Israeli rabbinical Orthodox establishment, through the what is called in Hebrew Rabbanut Rashit. And I didn't know that Reform Judaism then existed in Israel. So actually the DJ that we hired to do the music for our wedding, she revealed the big secret to us. And she said, there's a nice Reform rabbi in Tel Aviv. His name is Meir Azari. So we scheduled a meeting with Rabbi Meir Azari, and Meir said to us, well, I'm happy to perform your chuppah, but before I perform your chuppah, in order for you to be recognized as a married couple in the state of Israel, you have to go elsewhere, outside of Israel.
Abroad, to marry abroad.
To marry abroad. So we did that in Cyprus. We got the certificate of the civil marriage. We got back to Israel, and we registered as a married couple, while the beautiful Jewish chuppah that Rabbi Meir held for us on the shores of Caesarea is unfortunately not recognized by the state of Israel until this day, and it's been 30 years ago.
Wow.
But since that time, I self-recognize as a Reform, and afterwards I held several positions already in the Reform movement. I was a community coordinator in our northern congregation in Haifa, or Hadash, and then I went on shlichut. I was a Jewish agency shlicha to the Union for Reform Judaism. For 4 years, I was working out of the headquarters of the URJ, the Union for Reform Judaism, traveled a lot and got to know the diaspora Reform Jewry in a very special manner. And with that knowledge, I came back to Israel, and I was hired by my predecessor, Rabbi Gilad Kariv, to be director of congregations. And at that time, Gilad told me, well, you have a very big task. You need to more than double the amount of Reform congregations in Israel. That was literally my second day on the job. I was scared. I said to him, how do you do that? And Gilad said, well, you just don't say no to Israelis who want to start a congregation.
And you did it.
And we did, and I did it. We did it, actually, with the help of many wonderful leaders and rabbis that were there to initiate these congregations. And I found myself in people's living rooms and kitchens, and we would dream what it would mean to bring an egalitarian minyan for their town, for their place, for the first time. So that's my journey into the Reform movement.
So that's quite a journey, and I want to talk to you more. We'll talk soon about the challenges of the current moment, but I want to really continue this positive sort of strand of positive news. And I think really following on what you said, the Reform movement here has really grown and gained a lot more recognition and legitimacy over the last decade or two, as you just described. And I want you to share with us your thoughts about the current state of our movement in Israel. And I want you to share with us the findings of the survey that I mentioned before, because I think it's really interesting to see what Israelis are thinking now at this current moment about the Reform movement, and sort of comparing to where we've been just a few years ago, and what an amazing way we've gone through.
Right. So we decided every now and then we conduct a survey together, IMPJ, the Israel Movement for Reform and Progressive Judaism, together with IRAC, to see where we're at. And it was especially important for us because it was shortly after October 7th. And our movement responded for the events of October 7th, and we wanted to see how the Israeli society, how we're perceived within the Israeli society. And we were pleasantly surprised. We found that a third of the Israeli, the Jews in Israel support the Israeli Reform movement, and 6% out of the general Jewish population identify as Reform. Now, that equals close to 500,000 people, and we don't see the 500,000 people come every Kabbalat Shabbat to our congregations.
But we know they identify with our values.
But they identify with our not only with our values. If you wake them up in the middle of the night and you ask, what is your religious observance? What is your inclination? They would say, we're Reform. And we see them in our synagogues, on Yom Kippur and on major holidays, or when a family chooses to have a bar mitzvah, a bat mitzvah for their kid, and they want to have, all the family wants to sit together without a mechitza. And actually in that survey itself, you see that the majority of the Israelis, especially the secular Israelis, like more than 2/3, would rather sit in a synagogue without a partition, without what is called in Hebrew a mechitza.
And it's interesting because there used to be a saying that the synagogue most secular Israelis don't go to is Orthodox, and that's not the case anymore. It's clear.
It's totally not the case. And they are connected to their Jewish roots and values. We asked, what about services in the public sphere? And they have no problem in services in the public sphere as long as you don't have a partition.
As long as they're egalitarian.
As long as they're egalitarian.
And maybe another, we should mention another data, which is 56% of all Israelis prefer weddings outside the rabbinate. Going back to your story 30 years ago, we've come a long way. And we should mention that today, a lot of Israelis don't go to marry abroad in a civil marriage. They're not considered a married couple, but they are entitled to most or almost all of the rights of a married couple. And that's quite an unbelievable number. But I want to ask you also, what do you think is the influence of the current political situation in Israel? I mean, the fact that we are under a very extremist government that presents a very extreme kind of Judaism, how does it affect the Israeli public in their relationship to their Judaism in general and to liberal Judaism in particular?
I think we need to give the Israeli public more credit than one might think. And I think that Israelis are smart in that manner. We don't see, even though like it's becoming even like the government at least is trying to make it like a norm to be extreme and to show that there's only one legitimate part of Judaism. You don't see it not in the streets and you don't see it in our synagogues. On the contrary, again, and I think it's also a reaction to what happened on October 7th, our synagogues are full. You see more Israelis coming in because there is a need for a congregation. There is a need for community. There is a need for solace, spiritual solace. And we asked in that same survey, did you feel the need for more spirituality following the events of October 7th? And the majority of the Israelis answered that they did. They felt the need for ruchaniyut, this is the word for spirituality in Hebrew, and kehilatiyut, the word in Hebrew for community. So
and they find it in our communities.
And they find it within our communities. We never stop people at the door asking what kind of party did you vote for in the last elections. And in fact, it's also interesting when it comes to the elections, the identification with the movement is cross parties. So you see that on the left, about 81% out of the people that said that they voted for the Avodah Party, that's the Labor Party, they identify or they support. They support the Israeli Reform movement, but you also see it on the right. I'm not proud to say, but that I don't know, 11% out of the people who voted for the religious Zionist party, which means the party of Ben Gvir and Smotrich, say that they support the Reform movement.
That's actually very surprising.
This is not something that I'm proud of, but I just want to explain that it's cross parties. 18% out of the people who said that they voted for the Likud support our movement. So I do want to give the Israeli public more credit than that, and also that we're visible. That we're visible whenever we're there protesting for democracy, whenever we're there protesting for the release of the hostages. People know it's the Reform movement. They identify. I'm sure we'll talk about the Havdalahs in a minute, so you'll see them join our Reform movement Havdalot. So I think the Israeli public is very different than the government of Israel and the extreme parts that sometimes, unfortunately, we see on the news.
So let's talk a minute about the really troubling and challenging moment that we're in after sort of the positive messages.
Yeah.
I'm very proud that really our movement joined the pro-democracy protest, really one of the first organizations and the only religious organization that joined the protest against the legal coup back at the end of 2022. Unfortunately, the threat to Israel's democracy is still very much in effect, and I'm sure many of our American listeners can identify with what we are going through because we see really similar threats to American democracy. And I think the fact that we took a stand, even though it might have been controversial at first, is very meaningful and very important. We understood it's important to raise a voice for Israel's democracy because we see our role as really taking care not only for our rights, but really for the rights of all Israelis, regardless of race, religion, or gender. And I want to ask you, what do you think is the role of our movement in this current fight against extremism and for democracy? And we should mention again the pogrom in Ra'anana, the vandalism in Netanya of our congregation. So we see this in this really broad context of growing extremism, of growing violation of human rights that really caught us, in really under the line of fire. What do you think is our role at this moment?
So also, I think that we need to show the Israeli public that, Messianism is not Judaism, right? And that we have and we show a way of being able to be Jewish, be religious, and still promote liberal values and democratic values. I think that freedom of speech is very, very important with what happened in Ra'anana. And it doesn't matter if some people agree or disagree with how some parts of the Israeli society choose to observe the Memorial Day for the fallen soldiers. We need to give legitimacy to these voices, and this is what we chose to do on the eve of Yom HaZikaron. So we're showing the Israeli public that you can be both. You can be both Jewish and democratic and religious and promote tikkun olam and social justice and just be there for the Israeli public to raise that voice and just to show that we're not afraid. We won't stop demonstrating, and we won't stop from people to say, this is our way of praying. There's more than one way to be Jewish. We need to be proud of it, and we need to be present. So.
I of course, completely agree, and I think really that the violence that happened in Ra'anana was not only against the joint Palestinian-Israeli ceremony, it was really against the basic principles of democracy, because the people who
of freedom of speech.
Yeah, people who are beating up other people because the way they think, completely do not understand the basic fundamentals of democracy, and those people can also come and say, we do not agree with the way you pray, and we are going to oppose it violently. So it's really a slippery slope, and I think this is why it's important that every person that understands the importance of liberal values speaks up and does not, as you say, give in to threats. I want to ask you about really the response of our movement to October 7th and beyond. You spoke about this a little bit. I think it's important to sort of stress this on what we are offering Israeli society, a society which is, completely post-traumatic or still living the trauma. What our rabbis, our congregations are doing, and what is our focus in this moment, very, very difficult moment.
Right. So I want to say that, like many Israelis, October 7th touched us in a very personal manner, also as an organization, as an institution. We have a congregation in the Gaza envelope, congregation Sha'ar Negev, so we know the kibbutzim that were hurt. We know the families that lost their loved ones, and we know the hostage families. Personally, we know the people. So we were, and still are, very worried about them. Immediately, we responded with any kind of service that we could offer, whether it's Keren B'Chavod, our humanitarian aid fund, that started a hub for families who were displaced in Eilat. At some point, there were more than 50,000 evacuees that were transferred to Eilat, whether it was from the Gaza envelope or from the far north. And the volunteers of Keren B'Chavod were conducting activities there, mostly informal activities for children, because it took the government more than a month to respond, and there were no schools and no preschools and nothing. So a lot of it was what the civil society did, and we were part of all the civil society organizations responding. Our rabbi in the Gaza envelope area, she performed a lot of, unfortunately, bereavement circles, prayer circles, funerals at
Rabbi
the beginning.
Rabbi
Yael Vorgan. And a little later, as the war continued, families remembered that they needed the simcha. They also needed, ceremonies, so she conducted that, bnei mitzvah, bnot mitzvah. At the same time that Rabbi Yael Vorgan responded to the needs of the people who were badly hurt in the area of Gaza envelope, at the same time we responded to the distress of the people who were evacuated from the north. Rabbi Orit Rosenblit, who's the rabbi of our congregation in Kiryat Shmona. She herself, Kiryat Shmona is a town in the Upper Galilee. All of Kiryat Shmona at some point was evacuated for a very, very long time. And the city was badly hit, and just recently they started going back. Rabbi Orit Rosenblit was evacuated from her home in Metula. Metula is a town very close to the border with Lebanon. And again, we needed to provide those rabbis, Rabbi Yael Vorgan, Rabbi Orit Rosenblit, another rabbi by the name of Yael in Yael Kari, in the regional municipality that is called Mate Asher, also very close to the Lebanese border, on the shores of the Mediterranean. They were also evacuated, so we needed to respond to give those spiritual leaders the support that they needed and the tools that they needed in order to support all the families that were hurt and their own congregations. So, just an anecdote, I think a month ago, when they started to return for Kiryat Shmona, Rabbi Orit Rosenblit held an in-person Kabbalat Shabbat in Kiryat Shmona for the very first time since the beginning of the war.
Unbelievable.
Before that, it was either Zoom or we would have to find the funds in order to have the community congregate in Jerusalem or in Tel Aviv, in other places, in order to have a joint Shabbat together.
And another thing that we've done, and you mentioned before very briefly, is the Havdalah ceremonies that we've done every Shabbat since October of 2023 in Jerusalem, and also the largest one is at Hostage Square in Tel Aviv. And I know you have been attending this Havdalah almost every Shabbat, along with hundreds of Israelis.
Right.
Could you tell us a word about that? Because I think this is a very special event that we've been holding, led by Rabbis Mira Regev, Chen Ben Tzfoni, and Ofik Meir every Shabbat.
Every Shabbat, it's interesting. We call it the synagogue of the Israeli street, and we see a lot of hundreds of Israelis come, especially for the Havdalah that is held about an hour before the rally. Most of them are not part of the Reform movement, but they know we're conducting it, and they come for solace in order to sing together, pray together, cry together. So many moving minutes that are happening during the Havdalah, including hostage families that are speaking there.
And are saying how it's important to them, this gathering every Shabbat.
They really need it, and we have the regulars who are coming. I always remember the story of how I see one woman, and she's holding this plant, a bonsai plant that looks like a Havdalah candle. And at the end of Havdalah, I turned to her. I didn't know this woman. And she said, I said to her, what is this plant? And she said, first of all, thank you for holding the Havdalot. I didn't know about the Reform movement before those Havdalot, and I became a regular. I come here every Shabbat. And this plant is a gift to Lee Siegel. Lee Siegel is one of our leaders in our congregation on Kibbutz Gezer, and he's the brother of the hostage Keith Siegel, who returned home after almost 500 days. And that particular plant is called in Hebrew Sansevera Klua, a captive Sansevera. And she put a ribbon on the plant, and she wrote to Lee. That was when Keith was still held hostage, and she wrote to Lee, when Keith comes home, take the ribbon out.
Wow.
So, and that's
incredible.
just one story.
Yeah, I think those events are really very moving. I try to be there as often as I can, and we're really close to the ending. It's been very quick, but I want to end.
It's always fun talking to you, Orly, even though sometimes the subjects are really complicated.
Yeah, but I think our listeners appreciate how really those messages are very important at this moment, and I think our listeners would appreciate it if we could end on a positive note. And I want to ask you, in conclusion, what gives you hope these days?
I think that, first of all, the people, the Jewish people in general, not just the Jewish people in Israel, but the Jewish people all over the world, they're coming to Israel to strengthen us. They're being outside of Israel on our behalf. Gives me a lot of hope, the care of the diaspora Jews for what's happening in Israel, even if there's still the World Zionist Congress elections that are still going on. It gives me hope to know how many liberal Jews are taking a stance because they care about Israel, because they care about our movement and about the values that we're fighting for. They're there to cast their votes. So that gives me also a lot of hope, and in general, I think that Israeli people are very optimistic. They're strong, they're resilient. So that gives me a lot of strength. And you, Orly, give me a lot of hope too. Really.
Well, thank you. We will continue. I think to work for a better Israel. I think this current reality just makes us more determined to continue to promote our liberal values. So I want to thank you, Anna, for coming here. And thank you for everything you're doing.
Really interesting.
Really being our leader at this critical moment. And thank you for listening. We'll be together in the next episodes. Bye-bye.
Bye.